The side we will be presenting today is to convince you all that physical punishment, such as spanking, does not create aggressive adults. There is still relatively little evidence of a correlation between childhood spanking and aggression in adulthood. Researchers believe that poor socialization within a family may actually have a better chance of resulting in aggression in the child later in life. According to Taking Sides, children who were physically punished and given parental affection were less likely to become criminals. Behaviorists actually argue that spanking is just a type of operant conditioning in which the child learns to associate a bad behavior or the unwanted behavior by the parent with the physical punishment. So hopefully then that will get rid of the undesired behavior and the child will behave better. If administered correctly, and never just through a reaction of the parent's anger, spanking can be effective in creating an obedient child, as long as the child is communicated with afterward. As Bonrine said, when parents are firm and loving and communicate with the children are exceptionally competent. In the next few minutes, Hunter will present a few facts and statistics proving that physical punishment is not harmful to a child, and then Michael will conclude our presentation with a brief summary.
Okay, thank you. And the affirmative team, you now get a portion of time to ask questions. The negative team's closing. Okay.
Alright, everyone has an opinion. It's part of what makes us human. I am here to either change or strengthen your opinions with facts. Unfortunately, 83% of all articles that the affirmative side could use to strengthen their argument are based on opinions and have flawed execution. That is a fact. Around 70% of adults were spanked as children, and the vast majority of these people are not serial killers or rapists, but law-abiding, productive members of society. Not to mention that 4 out of 5 Americans approve of spanking even after they themselves were spanked as children. With first-hand experience like that, could they all be wrong? Violence is defined as physical force intended to abuse. Nowhere in the definition of spanking is violence implied. As a matter of fact, spanking is defined with the intent of not being violent.
That it causes aggression. In 250 actual case studies that have been done on this, 18 say that they do not correlate, and you might think that would be good for your side of you, but actually the other 232 cannot produce a correlation that would prove it. And I'd also like to tell you how weak the correlation that the other 232 studies show. In order to prove that smoking causes lung cancer, they had to produce a 20 to 30 times more correlation that somebody who smokes would get lung cancer. However, the media to violence The media violence and violence in real life correlation can even provide a 2 times more correlation. And also no study has shown that long-term violent effects can be caused by violent media. And we'd also like to state how, like in the Bobo doll situation, the more violent media that's presented is going to be more stimulating, so that's going to cause short-term excitability, which may come off as violence. It's also very difficult to produce a control group because there's no real placebo effect type of violence for the media. Because if you're going to have, like Reese said, somebody boxing and somebody, watching an eagle fly, those are 2 completely different things. They're not like viewing the same thing. Because if you were going to do a study on like a diet pill, one person would take the diet pill, one person would take a placebo, and that would be your control group. It's very difficult to produce this with violent media. And lastly, I would like to state the crime rates in America that have gone down since 1992, but the amount of media violence has gone up. And also, we have Japan with the most violent media in the world. However, their crime rate is significantly lower than here in America and across the globe. So I think when you take into account these facts, I think it would be very hard to say that media violence causes real-life violence.
All right, and thank you.
How can you explain that correlation if violent TV isn't a factor in aggressiveness in the long run?
Well, I think we have counterpoints to that in our study of Japan, which their murder rate is significantly lower, but the violent media that they have is significantly higher. And also, the crime rate in America has gone down since 1992. However, the violence in media has gone up. So I think either there wasn't enough, the population wasn't large enough in this study.
You also got to kind of take in perspective, like what goes on at their home too. Like, is this something like genetics or something like that, or just kind of like abuse or something like that?
And if you have a child that's getting prolonged exposure to violent media, they're also lacking other things that a child would need to become less violent, such as like teaching from a parent or getting out there and doing things in nature, which would also reduce your violent tendencies.
Child also, so that doesn't really show a correlation for the entire population. So how can you say that to us and then just give us the case studies as evidence of your side?
Well, I think where I'm coming from, at least, is there's no research that can prove either way. So I think to say that it does, it really is unfair to say that when there's a lot of other factors. And until we have clear research, I would say no, because you have some of these things that we've seen, and obviously you've seen things too, but I'd just say the lack of evidence would make me say that it does not provide a clear correlation, especially with when you take into account how significant the correlation is to prove other things such as smoking to lung cancer. We can't sit here and say that it does because we haven't been able to produce a clear correlation between the two.
That TV has more violence, more nudity, and more explicit content than it does here. However, 17-year-olds there are less aggressive than 70-year-old American men. Why do you think that is? What makes Americans more aggressive than people in other countries, even though that we have less violence on our TVs?
I think that it's not going to really matter where you are. Like, I know you think that environment is such a big deal, but it's just what they're seeing. They're seeing and observing these acts and retaining it. And then maybe children in America don't have as much control over their emotions, say, as somebody in Japan. but that doesn't mean that people in Japan aren't absorbing what they see and can use what they see and that knowledge they've gained of violence against somebody.
And in
Michaela?
TV shows, it shows usually the people committing the violent acts getting away with it, and kids are like, oh, I can do that and not get in trouble, so they're willing to imitate the behaviors.
I'll say something.
Sorry?
That question is completely irrelevant to what we're talking about. We're not talking about an amount of aggression. We're talking about any aggression shown towards violent television viewing.
But your main point is voting.
In 1859, Congressman Daniel Sickles shot a man by the name of Philip Key, who had been sleeping with his wife. During trial, Congressman Sickles' lawyer said that he was so enraged by this thought that he was not culpable. He would not be able to be found guilty for his crimes. Daniel Sickles then walked out of the court a free man. In the year 1979, Dan White planned and carried out a shooting on the mayor and city supervisor of San Francisco. At trial, White was judged temporarily insane due to the large amounts of junk food he ate before he committed the crime. This junk food supposedly caused a diminished mental capacity. This case has now been known as the Twinkie defense. White served only 8 years for the shooting and murder. In these cases, there's clearly shown a failure of justice. One man was simply angry at someone sleeping with his wife, and the other was obviously clearly made up simply to get off with the crime.
Carly?
Because like children with learning disabilities, they have a hard time putting it into the proper structure also because their brain doesn't function the same way as someone with normal communication abilities does. But then apes don't have those those areas of their brain. So saying that they're doing it without having that and saying that that's not language, I don't understand how you say
So the
that's not
question
language
is-
even though they're meaning to do it without language.
So the question
without
is-
that area.
What's the question?
How are you saying that, like, without that area, that's not language when people with learning disabilities don't have as strong an area and they still do it?
Well, people even with disabilities are able to distinguish that tickle you and you tickle are two different phrases that mean two completely different things. Whereas an ape signing symbols to try to communicate something will use those two phrases interchangeably.
Okay,
But if you're saying that the only way language is by speaking, then there's a lot of people in this world that don't have language.
But
Correct?
it's not just speaking when we talk about language. Like, it's the ability to make a sentence make sense and not have to repeat words or phrases or say them out of order. It's like, as you acquire language, you're able to make sentences that make sense, and the sentences become more complex, and animals don't have that capability.
I'm Matthew, and I will be introducing research facts that show that animals do not acquire language. According to the website Sweet 101, an article, has Kanzi the bonobo, really learned language? It states that vast majority of research with Kanzi and most other apes has been on language comprehension, not on their actual acquisition. We are not arguing the point that they do not comprehend our language. We are arguing the point that they acquire the ability to use our language. An example of this is that animals cannot tell the difference between the two phrases tickle you and you tickle. They use them interchangeably if they're trying to sign their point across. Whereas a human child that can either speak or sign knows that there is a difference between those two phrases. Yet an ape who is signing symbols uses them constantly